Good morning, everyone, and welcome to ODI. We're really delighted to be hosting this debate in partnership with Mercy Corps on the pros and cons of merging international NGOs. I'm Sara Pantuliano. I'm one of the acting executive directors of ODI. I'm looking for my fellow acting executive director, but he's not in the room. And I'm really delighted to be hosting this discussion because this is an issue that is growing in importance in the sector. This is hotly debated. You can see the number of people in the room, and we have an overflow room, so clearly it's attracting a lot of attention very early in the morning in London. We really want to discuss what are the benefits and risks of consolidating some of the biggest players in the humanitarian system, international NGOs, and there are many representatives I see today in the room and of course with me on the panel. The question is being gaining increasing traction because, of course, INGOs in particular have come under a lot of scrutiny because of their increasing competition, lack of coordination, competition that some feel as almost destructive and unnecessary duplication. And this is particularly a problem in crowded space like post-disasters environments or highly fragile contexts where we see, particularly in protracted crisis, a proliferation of actors. So it's a proposition that warrants attention, but it's also a complex and potentially controversial prospect. So what we thought we would do this morning is to try to unpack the debate and really look, in greater detail at some of the fundamental issues that we need to analyze. So, what are really the potential prospects for aid effectiveness? What are the possible consequences on the so-called localization of aid? And what are the potential effects of the NGO relationships with the public? So we'll have 3 rounds of debate around that, and then I'll open it up to the floor. And we have a big online audience that I welcome as well. For those in the room, please put your phones on silence, but do tweet. We are live tweeting the event. The hashtag is RemakeAid, so we want to generate, a passionate and intense conversation online as well. But let me introduce our speakers today. I'm delighted to, first of all, introduce the Permanent Secretary for the Department of International Development and former British PR Permanent Representative to the UN, Matthew Rycroft. Matthew, it's a pleasure to have you with us. I'll give Matthew the floor in a second for his keynote address. But with me on the panel, to my immediate right, I have Simon O'Connell, who is the Executive Director of Mercy Corps, who has 20 years experience in a lot of different countries around the world, really trying to always think of innovative partnerships, particularly in fragile environments, and how we can do what we do better. Further to my right is Amanda Mokwashi, who is the Chief Executive of Christian Aid. Amanda has a similarly long and distinguished career in the sector, but with a particular focus on women leadership, civic engagement, and volunteering. Next to Amanda, we have Nusra Ismail. I'm really delighted to have Nusra because she's traveled the farthest to come and be with us. Nusra is the acting director of the Somalia NGO Consortium, which gathers more than 70 international and national NGOs. And she's worked for more than 10 years in the sector, including as the country director for Oxfam in Somalia. And last but not least, Jonathan Brooker, who is the head of Solidarité International in the UK. Jonathan has worked in a lot of different crises, humanitarian crises around the world, big, major humanitarian responses. So as you can see, a wealth of experience and insights on the panel. But Matthew, would you mind setting the scene for us? Why is this debate so critical and timely for the sector?
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much to ODI and Mercy Corps for inviting me to this event, and well done for attracting such a brilliant panel and such a large audience. So it's very great to see so many people here, and I'm sure following online as well. As Sarah said, I'm Matthew Rycroft, the Permanent Secretary at the Department for International Development. And the first thing to say is I think it's important for DFID not to have a view on precisely how many NGOs should there be in the sector. So I'm not going to answer that question literally, but I am going to briefly make the case for why the sector should be as strong as possible and full of as many high-quality NGOs as possible. And that case, I suppose, is blindingly obvious, which is that there's a super big job to do out there. And we, DFID, require a vibrant civil society sector in this country and in the countries that we're operating in as our delivery partners, as champions, as advocates, as innovators, and so many other roles as well. So that's the case that I'll be making. I don't think, by the way, that this debate should be limited to the humanitarian sector, although I can see that that's sort of where it has started. And talking to the panelists earlier, it does sound as though the debate is a bit more advanced in that part of the sector than in everywhere else. But what I'm talking about is the totality of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which broadly speaking can be summarized under the 5 Ps of people: planet, prosperity, partnerships, all underpinned by peace. And those are the 5 big things that the SDGs seek to do by 2030. And they are the 5 big things that DFID seeks to do by 2030. And we've got a 6th one in our new single departmental plan, which is being launched this week, which is a Q for quality, making sure that everything that we do, this is a big Rory Stewart passion, is done in a high quality, impactful way. So I don't think there are any easy solutions to this question about consolidation. If there were, we wouldn't be having the debate. We're having the debate because it's difficult. I think we should ask ourselves, are the experiences from other walks of life, particularly from business on mergers and acquisitions, do they point to any particular answer to this question? I don't think that they do. You know, a merger or an acquisition is not always the right answer. Quite often they are very expensive and they don't always succeed. On the other hand, it is striking. I don't know if this statistic is apocryphal or not, but someone yesterday told me that the number of NGOs seeking to be involved in delivering aid in Nepal after the earthquake was 7,000. I don't know if that is an apocryphal number or not, but even if it's only half that, I mean, that is an extraordinarily large number, which would possibly suggest that a bit of consolidation might not be a bad idea. I think there are 5 big things that we should think about in seeking to answer the question. Just to repeat, I'm not myself planning to answer the question, but I hope that these 5 things might give a framework for the panel and for all of us collectively to answer the question ahead. And the first is about money. If you think about the finances, and you think in particular about the drive to generate income that so many charities, that so many NGOs, must spend so much of your time on. What does that do to the size of the organisation, and what does that relentless quest for sustainable income mean in terms of the number of organisations in the sector? And in particular, are there unintended consequences of that drive that might get in the way of quality of delivery, and of the next thing I'm going to talk about, which after money is trust. If you think about trust in the sector, particularly today, big day for Oxfam with the Charity Commission report coming out. I think all of us should be thinking about what does it take to rebuild, to regain, and then to retain trust between public opinion in this country and countries like ours, and the organisations which are seeking to do so much good in the world, and which are necessary to do good in the world. I think that we've really collectively had a bit of a wake-up call over safeguarding, and again, I don't think there's any simple, direct correlation between the number of organisations in the sector and the level of trust, but clearly there is some sort of relationship between the quality of the sector and the level of trust. The third thing to think about is, in the jargon, the localization agenda, or sort of put into normal words, how to make sure that in the countries that we are seeking to support and to deliver, to help implement the Sustainable Development Goals in, clearly it makes sense to have a strong, vibrant civil society sector there as well as in our countries. And how do we do that? And how do we make sure that we are supporting, broadly speaking, smaller, more local NGOs in all of our work? Again, starting with the humanitarian, but thinking more broadly across the whole of the development sector as well. Fourthly, and related to that localization agenda, is thinking about beneficiaries, thinking about the direct link with the people we are seeking to serve and to support. They clearly must be at the heart of everything that we do. And let's face it, I don't think that they have been sufficiently at the heart of everything that all of us do in the recent past. And potentially there is a natural sense of the bigger an organisation gets, the easier it is to sort of forget at some level the people who that organisation has been set up to serve. So I think, again, an interesting question as NGOs, or some NGOs, get bigger is how do they retain that direct link to the beneficiary. I certainly know from a DFID perspective, and let's face it, DFID is a large organisation in the sector, that it can be quite difficult for us always to remember the beneficiaries and always to put them at the heart of our decision making. And the fifth thing to be thinking about is diversity. Strongly important for its own sake, but also, in my view, a driver of innovation in the sector. So clearly, if one were a fan of consolidation and you took it to the extreme and you had only a very, very small number of NGOs, then as a minimum, you would be losing something in terms of innovation, and you'd be losing something in terms of diversity. That said, the number of civil society organisations overall has grown hugely. Just in the UK, it has grown from 50,000 to over 160,000 in the last generation. The market is literally flooded with charities, some of them very small, doing very, very particular things. So I think, another question for this debate is whether that sort of spread of very small organisations has got out of control. That's not to say that very small grassroots charities don't have an important role to play. Just in the balance of things, where should we be looking in order to really maximise the overall impact and the overall quality of the sector? So I think if you put those five things together, the money, the trust, the local NGOs, civil society, the beneficiaries, and sort of diversity and innovation, I think that, if we could answer that question, really maximise the quality of the culture of the sector as a whole, then I think the answer to this question about consolidation will come out. The final thing to say, perhaps I should have said it at the beginning, just a word about definitions. When I talk about consolidation, I don't mean what I take should be happening anyway, which is making sure that two different NGOs working in a particularly difficult place should be cooperating on a single way to do security, or potentially even a single way to use technology. That to me is not consolidation. That is sort of good common sense cooperation. I would very much hope that that is happening everywhere, and if it isn't, got a bigger problem than I thought. What I mean by consolidation is actually merging different organisations into each other to have a smaller number. And with that, back to you, Sarah. I look forward to commenting on the debate to come at the end of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthew. Those are really important points, and I will come back to you at the end, to hear your reflections on the debate. Let me just pick on one of the 5 points you've outlined, because I think reflecting on the perspective of the people the NGOs were set up to serve is particularly critical, and I'm hoping that we can have this debate today with their view in mind, because often debates that we hold in London or certain other places in the north are devoid of that perspective. So it would be important to think, in what way this consolidation debate is important to improve the way in which we operate for the people that we are supposed, to serve. And so let's start the debate. Simon, I'll come to you first, because you've been active in this debate, and I want to come to you particularly with the angle of aid effectiveness and whether really consolidating, you think, can increase the efficiency of NGOs, or are we going to have more of the same, just in bigger chunks, with big organizations, but still actually not delivering as efficiently and as perhaps appropriately as possible?
Great, yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Matthew, very much. We recognise that DFID aren't going to take an opinion on this, and we welcome your remarks there and creating some further space and appetite for what I do feel is a really, really, really important conversation. And absolutely, I have been kind of poking away at it a little bit recently, because I feel somewhat passionate about it, and I would want to put out there, first and foremost, look, this is a complex subject matter, and sort of 3-minute panel slots. It's not very easy to convey all that complexity or 800-word op-ed, so I don't want to come across as flippant and give the sort of impression that I've got all the answers to this. It's mega complex. That's the first thing, and then secondly, we're having this conversation at an extraordinary time of huge, widespread humanitarian need. 150 million almost people in need of that humanitarian assistance, and 2 billion living in fragility, conflict, and violence-affected environments. So our work has never been more important, and we're doing extraordinary work, all of us, all our organizations in different ways, in many different environments. That being said, some things need to change. So I thought I'd just offer a few reflections on the feedback I've got from those that we reached out to whilst preparing for this this debate. First thing interesting, a lot of people said, it's great to happen. The system is clearly broken. And I was one of those people. I was fortunate enough to be at the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in, it's over 3 years ago now, and the grand bargain and the commitments we all made. And I do think particularly around things like localization, we haven't done enough. We're behind on the targets that we set, and something needs to change. And that's come through, and it's sort of testament to why there's so many people in this room and online. We recognize, and I thought maybe we could do a show of hands of who thinks that some things need to change. We won't do that, but I do think we all, in our different ways, recognize that the system is not only broke in many ways, but also largely broken. And I think sometimes on the NGO side, we have a tendency to sort of go, you UN lot, you're the broken part of the system. But I think we, as NGOs, need to kind of own some of that brokenness and be open to some disruption. That was the first bit. Then the second bit was why focus on this? There's so much else going on. We don't want to, divert attention from the extraordinary levels of need and the importance of what we do. And I think that, that has come through quite clearly, that there is some concern that if we debate this or overly debate it, we're not going to be talking about other really important things, safeguarding being sort of top of the mind this morning. So we want to be sure that we have space for this conversation, but we don't want to take up so much space for it that we detract from other important areas. Then there's this bit about, well, look, what about small is beautiful, or what about diversity, as you said, Matthew, or what about innovation? On the innovation one, I kind of chuckle a little bit, because when I think of innovation, I sometimes think, Google are kind of an innovative organization still, right? They've got their 10% and their, space for innovation. They're also kind of a big organization, right? We at Mercy Corps, we're annual global revenue around $500 million. We're nothing like Google, and we pride ourselves on the importance of that innovation. So I don't worry if Mercy Corps was a bit bigger, or if it was consolidated in with some other organizations, that we would lose that space for innovation.
Also was efficiency.
Yeah, efficiency, but also, and then the point around diversity, and we need lots. But Matthew, some of the numbers he's thrown out, number of organizations here in the UK, I can't remember. I had some stats. I think there's someone from Alnap here, 4,000 in the wider system. South Sudan, 250 plus NGOs. Nasri, you'll tell us how many in Somalia. There are a lot of us, and of course we want different types of organizations, but I do think there are too many. And then that leads me to the point, the other question which has come up, well, what do you mean? Do you mean like at a centralized level? Do you mean at a country level? Do you mean everywhere? I mean really first and foremost in the most fragile environments, those protracted crises, those Eastern DRCs, 25 years post-Rwandan genocide, where we've got such extensive humanitarian need, and where NGOs are at times often tripping up over one another. And that's where the needs are greatest. That's where we're not on track to reach the SDGs. That's where more needs to happen. And then there's a big question that's come up about, how do you do it? And that's where we need the big brains of folks at ODI and others to engage in a work stream, which we hope that some donors and other partners will invest in and support, to really generate that evidence around would indeed less small to medium-sized organizations, particularly in the most fragile environments, would that correlate with greater impact? And that's where we on the NGO side, including at a governance level, including with our boards, need to step up and put some targets in place around concretely what are we going to do in this area. And then the last thing that's sort of come up quite a bit is, but look, we have loads of consortia already. We're already coordinating more than ever. And Sarah said, I spent many years overseas, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, and I've engaged a lot in those consortia mechanisms, and they're really important. And there are more of them, and they are certainly generating efficiencies. But I wanted to give one example. Recently I was in Iraq. I got out into Mosul. It's absolutely devastated, as many of us will know. Folks will tell us it's going to cost $50 billion to reconstruct Mosul. We lead, and it's fabulous support from the British government, from DFID. It's the Cash Consortium. One of our commitments at the World Humanitarian Summit was to deliver 25% of our humanitarian assistance through cash. We're now at 40%. Great. It's a consortium. I won't give you the names of the other 4 NGOs who are in it, but it's terrific, and it's big impact, and it is indeed more efficient. Last few years, through that program, we've touched the lives of 750,000 people in and around Mosul. It's just fabulous. Big impact program. It's, externally appraised. It's got good metrics. And you know what? All of those 5 NGOs in it, we've all got our country directors, we've all got our security coordinators, we've all got our procurement people. There's less procurement on the cash side. But all of that, and I did a kind of quick top line number crunching thing yesterday as I was coming into London. I calculate it costs roughly $500,000 a year to run those senior leadership teams of those 5 organizations in that one context. So $2.5 million for 5 of them, yeah? Do we really need 5 country directors, 5 finance directors, 5 HR managers, 5 security focal points, 5 procurement people? Do we really need all of those? And if we only needed 1, okay, that would generate just on one program, and British government gives us £18 million for that program, touching lives of hundreds of thousands of people. It's a big impact. But if we only needed 1, that would save in one context $2 million a year. And probably we don't quite need 1. We may need a bit more than that, right? But imagine if we saved $1 million in that one context. $1 million. And then if we push that out into 10 other really fragile environments, that's $10 million a year in savings. Just through one mechanism like that, $10 million. And then imagine if we said those organizations, you don't also need 5 executive teams who cost a little bit more again, a bit more centralized, a bit more removed from those contexts. Imagine the savings you could generate through that kind of approach. And then imagine what you could do with that money through investments in safeguarding mechanisms, through investments in greater support to local organizations, through investments into generating, Matthew, again, your point around evidence and impact. And then imagine what we could do as a community if we communicated out more effectively the extraordinary importance of our work in places like Mosul and Eastern DRC with concrete, hard evidence through a more value for money approach. And imagine what that would do to, in some little way, restoring some trust in the sector where less than half of people now have confidence in our work. I'll stop there.
I need to stop
Sarah.
here, otherwise we can have a debate. But
Okay.
this is an important straw man that you put out there. If we had less, we would have a lot more money to support people. That would mean our impact, would multiply. Amanda, Nusra, Jonathan, who wants to start? What do you think? Do you agree with that?
Maybe let me come in. Thank you. I think 3 quick points from me, and I'll come at it from a slightly different angle. The projections at the moment are that there are going to be over 800 million people living in extreme poverty, that we're not going to be able to meet, to take those people out of extreme poverty. That's one. The conversations that we've heard, we've had, the demonstrations that we've seen in terms of climate change suggests that actually we're in a bit of a dire straits as a global function. If you look at the number of conflicts that are emerging all over the place, again, this paints a world that is really broken in terms of the economy, in terms of conflict, and in terms of politics. So for me, I think that talking about the numbers of NGOs that are needed to try and fight this somehow becomes a bit of a red herring. I think we need to be talking about the quality of what different development and humanitarian actors are doing. And that's where I would really like to focus. That's number one. I think my second point is that we have huge development and humanitarian systems like the UN multilateral agencies. We've got multinational bodies. We've got already in the private sector, in the public sector, we have examples of huge bureaucracies trying to deliver humanitarian and development. I don't think that, we should all become one size and one way of working in terms of development. Clearly, what we've experienced over the last 40 years suggests that, it's not the way we are currently structured, all of us, all humanitarian development actors, has not delivered what we wanted to deliver. And therefore, I don't think that the civil society organizations should become a replica of the UN agencies, or should become a replica of the private sector multinational bodies, or should become a replica of government. We are different. And the reason that we're different is we're able to connect at a very personal, very individual, and very local level. That means that actually it's not about the money. My last and third point, and I'm happy to come back to this as the debate goes on, is that what we measure, so we're talking about aid effectiveness at the moment, and I would probably like to suggest that in terms of effectiveness, let's move away from transaction costs, from those type of efficiencies, understanding it from a money angle. Let's go to what is effectiveness. Let's talk about effectiveness in terms of participation, in terms of democracy, in terms of values, in terms of transformation. And if we're talking about that and we start focusing on measuring that, then I'm telling you that huge bureaucracies will not be able to reach in those corners where it doesn't make money sense, but it makes human sense to go and actually help in terms of humanitarian action and intervention. So for me, I would like to move the conversation that direction. I'm not concerned really about the number of NGOs in the UK, or the number of international. I think the question also that we need to really think about is something that Matthew flagged up right at the end when I think, Matthew, you said, if we're not collaborating, you would be worried. I think you need to be worried because I think what is the nature and quality of our collaboration when it matters and when it is needed? And I think those are the conversations that we need to be having. I'll stop there to give others a chance, but happy to come back.
A perfect moment to bring in Nusra and really see from your perspective. Someone is saying if we have less organization, we'll have more money to deliver, we'll do a better job. Amanda is arguing, well, you end up with big bureaucracies that they won't necessarily do a better job because ultimately it's about the quality of what we do and it's about removing some of the transaction costs. You see this from the ground where you do have a large number of organizations in Somalia. What's your perspective on this?
Thank you, and thanks to ODI and everybody here who's invited us. I think my answer is going to be a little bit of both. I think the key question underneath this consolidation of having less and maybe having more then in terms of impact, I think from where I sit in Somalia, in Mogadishu, at a very small location with a lot of security, one would think you would need some kind of change. That's ultimately the entity here that we're dealing with. We need change because we're ever more dealing with a change in the way climate affects our communities. We're dealing with change in terms of how governments are showing up and authorities are coming into their proper role. Perhaps not to the best way that we would like it as NGOs, but there is a different player at play. And they also have a sense and an opinion. And I will share some of those later. But I think running a consortia of more than 80 members now for the Somalia NGO Consortium, which is a mixed fora, I would agree, less would be more. When I came into the sector, it was a headache to convene all of these actors, to put together a plan for every drought and flood, every crisis. But after a while, come to think of it, actually, I think we have to be ambitious in what we're calling for. And it wasn't necessarily less meetings, fewer discussions on the same issue. It was the sense that for every issue that we were dealing with, it was uncertain. Everything we were dealing with, it was uncertain year on to year on. And what we're dealing with was something that calls for, yes, more nimble, more agile organization models that we haven't seen to date. One of the things that came to me and was very clear is choice. There is a choice in the matter for communities and how they accept work and how they accept to be supported and how they accept certain aid. And I think we want to be mindful of that as we're thinking about this discussion in London, is that communities are going to have a choice. I would like to see that choice played out. I think that choice playing out would mean that some NGOs, international or otherwise, they're going to fall out. They might be deemed dead weight. Their business model may not survive in a place like Somalia. So there is a natural way that I think we're gaining more forceful NGOs who can work in some of the toughest areas, but may not necessarily be.
Can I challenge all of you? I mean, we have, of course, fewer. The UN agencies are not as many as the NGOs, and yet there is a lot of, kind of diversity of opinion as to how effective or efficient they really are on the ground. What would change if we had sort of fewer NGOs in terms of effectiveness from the perspective of delivering locally?
Well, I mean, I think this is why I'm saying it's really important to consider the community's perspective. They may want to have more because it takes a certain NGO with a certain value, with a certain power structure, with a certain history and entry point to that country where, it will be a natural self-selection. I also believe we don't need to compare ourselves to the UN. I really believe that NGOs have a certain acceptance rate in Somalia, and we should build on that, and we should have those conversations with the communities to indicate to us what is the future of NGOs in a country like Somalia that is becoming sort of slowly coming out of a fragile state. And so I think it's a number of things, but for me, one of the things I worry about in a consolidated fashion, some of the NGOs work that we do on the ground, is we're having a lot of issues already with localization. So the more NGOs we have, it has actually led to more partnerships, more relationships with local actors. You consolidate. Are we also consolidating power? I think that's a really big question that we have to struggle with, and we have to say we need change, but I'm not sure if consolidation is going to be the change. It's going to be the thing that we want. The second thing I would hearken all of us to think about again is really choice. There are many companies who make brooms. I don't think they're having discussions about consolidation. I think they look at the communities and markets they serve, and that lends itself to a model that will survive. So it's more about surviving and becoming the organization of the future that's going to deal with all these crises, all of these countries that are moving either towards fragility or away from fragility, and less about us sort of thinking about what would be easier. It's never going to be easier, whether you have few or more. I think the question that we're dealing with is we need to make a change. Yes, is consolidation it? I'm not convinced. I think we need to put choice in the hands of communities. And then after that, I think we'll see what the model, what the organization, what the ideal number of NGOs are going to be in each country, because people are going to participate. I expect people to have a discussion. And the people that I've talked to are not really concerned with the number. They're concerned with impact. They're concerned with acceptance. They're concerned with how an organization shows up. The best organizations in Somalia that I've seen are not known by their entity or their internationalness or their name. They're actually never heard of, because they work through a local partner, and they're not there because they don't have access, but their aid is there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nusra. Yes, I just want to flag that Nusra has moved us on very neatly to the second part of the debate and the impact, that any consolidation would have on, really enabling humanitarian action to be more locally driven. And you make some very important points as to, how this is seen and received, and the danger of, further consolidating powers and alienating local players more. But I think, from what I've heard so far, everybody thinks there has to be a level of change, and so thinking in terms of what is the best change and how we achieve it, as we discussed, how we can improve this drive towards, making sure that local humanitarian action is, sort of closer and more locally driven. It's important. Amanda, you want to come on that, and on the while, Jonathan, you haven't had a chance to react yet.
Yes, no, I was just going to pick up on the question of power or consolidation of power. I think that Nusra was talking about, because I think we shouldn't underestimate that, especially if what we're talking about is consolidation of international NGOs. That quite a number of NGOs are pretty big as they are, and they have got a disproportionate amount of power and influence in the sector. If we consolidate, what we are simply doing is we are going back, retrogressing from that redistribution of power to the global south and centralizing it again to the global north, because that's where the big international NGOs are. And so if we're moving into the conversation around localization, I know for us as Christian Aid, I know we've got our personal experience as an organization is working through local partners. When I joined Christian Aid last year, I went on program visits. My first instinct, because I'm hardwired to think brand, I'm hardwired, I've come from the UN, I've come from other organizations. I went in there and I was asking my country officers, how come I can't see Christian Aid's brand? You know, where's the logo? Where's everything? And they say to me, Amanda, we don't do that because we work through local organizations. What we do in terms of local partners is really try to build their capacity. Now, the reason why we're challenged in terms of the grand bargain and localization is also we think that it's just about giving them money so that they can do some work with it. No, it's really looking holistically at the local organization and saying, what is their capacity? Governance, you know, do they have resources? Do they have capability? Where are they going? And then investing in that. My last comment on the localization agenda is, if we think that development is cheap, then we haven't been paying attention. If we think humanitarian interventions are cheap, we haven't been paying attention. There is no way they're going to be cheap. If they're going to come cheap, then they're not going to last. If we want lasting, sustainable, and clean development, and I'm not separating humanitarian and development. That's where I'm coming from. Because for me, Amanda, on the ground, if I'm in Malawi and Cyclone Dire hits, I don't care that you're coming as a humanitarian agency or a development agency. It's impacting me as a whole person. So, you know, we really have to come to grips with the fact that it's going to be expensive, it's going to cost money, it's going to require resources, it's going to require innovation, and it's not just from government, from the private sector, but from private individuals as well, making those connections. And so for me, localization is the answer, but hopefully we come back and talk about quality collaboration, because I think that's where we need to change how we're working with each other to deliver to scale.
Jonathan, I want to bring you in, because I know your perspective on this, and it'd be useful to discuss that. But undoubtedly, when you have thousands of partners on the ground, working to support local partners is going to be hard, and working efficiently and even collaborating is going to be very hard. So, how did you've worked in many emergencies? I'm sure you've seen these challenges firsthand.
So I think we all agree that we need to make things more efficient, we need to make things more effective, we need to make them more relevant, they need to be more timely, they need to be more localized across the board. I think, and you touched on it earlier, Matthew touched on it, early doors we've got to say, are people at the centre of what we're doing? Have we reignited purpose within the sector like we need to? And when we look at the question of merging, what we need to ask is, with diversity and inclusion, are we giving ourselves the tools, opportunity, ammunition to be able to overcome the complex challenges that we face in multiple countries across the globe? I worry a little bit if we take an isolated example and say, well, if we merge this consortium here, that's more cost efficient, because effectively what that is just an argument related to the economy of scale in that specific setting. To do that at a global level, what you start to do is for me, create challenges around efficiency, effectiveness, and a really important word that hasn't come up yet, but risk. So what I look at is effectively this is a sort of technical proposed solution to what is more broadly an adaptive challenge, a challenge that I think we need to understand better, and that probably is going to find solutions out of shifts in the culture, attitudes, and behaviors of the sector, rather than an adaptation or a changing of the architecture of the sector. By merging NGOs, and this has already been touched on quite a lot, what we're effectively talking about is bigger, better? Is industrial scale aid going to be more cost efficient and effective? And I would say, in metaphorical terms, it worries me this, because it looks like a sort of captain and a crew worried that the ship is sinking and cutting off the lifeboats in order to reduce the weight. And that doesn't add up. To be very clear, already about 90% of global humanitarian funding is in the hands of the big UN humanitarian agencies and big NGOs, already, now. So the resources are already heavily concentrated. So what I would ask is, with that financing information, do we see a more effective, efficient, timely, predictable, reliable sector? I'm not sure we do. Instead, I think what we see is a system where the kind of giants of the sector, giants that, speaking candidly, have been plagued by scandals, that have been riddled with toxic working environments, that have contributed to an environment where there's more prescriptive donorship, where there's risk aversion, where there's an increased demand for immediate results. We have hyper-regulation coming in, and humanitarian leadership seems to be ever more judged and therefore preoccupied with growth, with political influence and competition for resources. So already that model doesn't seem to demonstrate the evidence of efficiency and effectiveness in big aid. These things to me have seriously damaged the sector per se, because once you've got the headline organizations facing those types of challenges, the trickle-down effect, like we mentioned earlier, on public trust deficits is serious. So in essence, I think, we do look at this kind of technical argument of economy of scale, but the evidence isn't there to support it. I know that we don't want to get stuck talking about transactional costs, but I haven't seen evidence to suggest that big aid from donor to delivery in terms of transactional cost is more effective or efficient. I just haven't simply seen that evidence. I would be curious if people can propose it. And there's a lot of reasons why, and actually somebody mentioned earlier, we already have the UN as the big system, the big aid system. And what do we see there? And I have worked with the UN. What we see is bloated HQs, bloated regional offices. We see high salaries, high benefits. We see multiple layers of managerial staffing. We see laborious and time-consuming systems and procedures. And we see massive security, travel, and logistics costs. That's what we see. As we scale down, organizations sort of peter out a little on those things. So I would say there is generally a lack of evidence to substantiate the claim that big is more efficient in this context. I also think we have to look at what the academic world has provided us with, and that is a lot of information and research around organizational efficiency and behaviors. What comes out from a lot of that is that there are optimal sizes that organizations can function. There is too small to be relevant or significant or have big impact, and there's too big to work, there's too big to function. With that type of understanding, what we start to see is sometimes organizations reach that tipping point where they become ungovernable. Processes get heavy, risk aversion gets more, there becomes an incoherence in the common vision of an organization. And they become breeding grounds for the types of behaviors which unfortunately have bubbled to the surface in the last years. So what I'm talking about by that is characteristics like nepotism, corruption, harassment, etc.
I want a debate on this. Obviously, you have very, very different views, and you work in a much bigger organization where maybe those challenges around bureaucracy do.
Can I come in, Sarah, with the nautical metaphor, which was really good? I see it differently. I see the system as a supertanker going down, and I see plenty of lifeboats, and I see no one using them. I just see we're so stuck in our system of being on the big ship. It's so big that we can't turn it. We keep talking about it. There are lifeboats there, but we need to get in them. We need to deploy them. We need to shift the system. And I like the metaphor very much. I also
culture. We're all saying the same.
But this is the frustration part. Is we're acknowledging, all of us here, we're acknowledging the system is broken. All of us are clearly immensely proud of what we're achieving and the importance of our work, and scale of need, etc. It's never been greater, but we're stuck on, so how are we going to shift it? And yet I'm not in any way advocating for 5 or even 10 behemoth NGOs out there doing everything. I hear the PowerPoint is hugely important, but frankly, I refuse to accept that and there's been just so many of those environments. It could be parts of South Sudan, it's definitely northeast Nigeria. It's those really difficult environments where there are too many small to medium NGOs who are not able to get to that level of scale of impact, who are not able to generate that amount of evidence, and who are not able to then take the opportunity to replicate what is working in other contexts. The premise of my argument is, if we free up some resources very explicitly with the intention of then shifting the power dynamic of deploying those resources into those more local organizations, we will get more effective as a system. And that takes all of us, very much inclusive of myself and Mercy Corps, to be open to being disrupted ourselves, to start to walk the walk more deliberately ourselves. And I do think there are just too many small and medium-sized organizations out there. And I think the evidence backs that up. And my hope is that what we will do is we will make a commitment with donor support, with investment to generate, and I hear you, Jonathan, clearly there isn't, where is the evidence around this? Let's make a commitment from today to generate some of that evidence around an alternative way of structuring ourselves.
Sorry, can I just check something?
Yeah.
Are you saying that too many small and medium NGOs out there, or international working out there?
International working out there. International working out there.
Because I think it's really important to make that, to have that clarity. In quite a lot of countries that we work in, there will be small NGOs, there'll be community-based organizations, and there'll be, if they're medium, local or national NGOs, that's good. And some of them will be really big. You have Bangladesh has got one of the world's largest NGOs, BRAC. I think that it's really important that they see sight of resources, capacity and capabilities, right? But I think even for international NGOs, let's talk about UK international NGOs. They're small international NGOs that are really specialized and are very creative, very agile, flexible, adaptable, and innovative. I think for those of us who consider ourselves to be big international NGOs, we need to leave room to work in partnership with them, collaborate and leverage their skills and expertise much more. You know, I was in Bolivia. I'm not saying Practical Action is very small, but I was really impressed to find that in there we were tapping into Practical Action's very specific scale on agriculture and farming, right? Because we know that as Christian Aid, that's not our strength. But we were able to bring in others and really collaborate. For me, I want to talk about, let's move from consolidation to effective collaborations.
That's clearly a recurring theme around how we collaborate better, how we change our culture.
Yeah.
I have a barrage of questions from the online
Sorry, give me
audience.
30 seconds on that, just to be really clear. So and there's wonderful, small boutique, niche, very specialised organisation in the UK and right around the world. They don't all need to be opening sub-offices in Abyei in South Sudan, right? But the tendency is the more you grow, okay, let's open a country, let's have the country structure, let's have the costs around it. Let's bring, Mercy Corps, we have a technical support unit comprised of our various areas of technical expertise. Let's use those kind of technical support areas and provide them to other organizations, and let's absorb some others into our own structures, rather than the big infrastructure on the ground, which is so expensive and oftentimes so inefficient.
Can I just say, I think, we're coming back to cost a lot. And I happen to be of the opinion that, and I don't know where the literature is, I think we would love to see the investment in learning about what is the right size, sure. But I'd also believe that we don't have to wait for the evidence. Clearly, we've gotten so big, not because of evidence, but because of evolution and where we are. I can tell you I work for CARE International. I would love to see what that CARE International model was 15, 20 years ago. Because it's not the model of today. But I think out of need, out of necessity, they have come to be where they are. It would be good to figure out if they can collapse small, if they can go back, and what would be then the incentive. What we need to do is really figure out again, can we incentivize change without us losing diversity? I think diversity counts for a lot in a place like Somalia, where again acceptance and not being accepted are so high, where risk tolerance is so high, and it's a differentiating factor. Not every big INGO has the same appetite for risk, and the same could be said of a donor. So I would hate to be in a place where the needs are so high, where access issues are really at a very, very high level, and we have the option of one consolidated NGO, and it gets a letter, and they're taking out. What do you do then? So I think we need to be really smart about how we are positioning these models, not just to save money, but where are the people? The people will have a choice. The governments that are beginning to really grapple with their role, some of them are, taking power to a whole different level than we've seen, are going to also have a choice about which NGOs are going to be able to operate in that country, right or wrong. So I think this is a time to really invest into more, actually, smaller NGOs, not necessarily bigger, not necessarily one entity, but also give ourselves the ability to remain alive to these crises that are unpredictable, that are coming back, that are climactic, that are cyclical, and that don't necessarily tell you how to address them. But what are the incentives, I think, for current collaboration? We don't incentivize collaboration very well. We don't incentivize localization very well. We don't incentivize sharing of knowledge very well. I think there's a lot of learning in the sector when I can convene 100 NGOs and see their missions are quite the same, their structures are almost entirely the same, but there's something about their output and impact. They look very different because they show up differently in communities, because they have different acceptance rate, because they've been around so long that they're iterating on their processes. So it would be interesting, I think, to look at this not necessarily from a practical perspective of what would be easier for us to implement, but what is the learning telling us? And I think then we can have that conversation. But currently, I see no problem with Care Mercy Corps being very small. But that seems like an internal discussion, not necessarily a sector-wide discussion.
This is a really good point on which to open to the audience. I think you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of the incentives and how we shift our culture, and then the models. There may be a variety in different countries, but how we make sure that as a sector we really change the way in which we behave generally, and then progressively in some places there may be fewer players on the ground, in others we may need more, but it is the way in which we work and the enduring cultural paternalism and competition of the sector that remains the problem in so many contexts. So I was saying I have a huge number of questions online, but I want to start with the colleagues in the room who have made an effort to be here bright and early. There is a roving mic. When you take the floor, please be brief, because as you can see there are a lot of people that want to come in. Say who you are, if you are affiliated to any organization, and pose the question briefly. I'll start with the colleague here, and then I'll go to the other side, please. Can I? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Really interesting comments from everybody. My name is Dr. Salma Basi. I'm the CEO of eWorldwide Group. I think I can see completely different views being presented for different situations, and I think we have to look at the country that we're in and the crises that we're addressing. And I think, to Simon's point, I completely agree with you, the fat belt of the duplication. I work a lot in northern Nigeria, northeast Nigeria, and we see all these big international NGOs at the border, nobody going into the no-go and high-risk areas where we need to have access. So in my mind, I see the great need for people like DFID and other donor agencies to create the incentive immediately for collaboration and the sharing of information and the administration belts that could be taken out and help us actually have targeted interventions that would be more effective. That's one. So I totally agree with this model. But I kind of see a line. One is the operationalization and the organization coming into a particular country, then coming down to the next level, which is actually implementing the interventions and monitoring and evaluation and having the access to make sure that there's a line that is defined with a collaboration with the local NGOs and the smaller, more capable NGOs with the specific skills that are required, because there's many success stories are very few, failures are very high, and unqualified, untrained, without the effectiveness, are given the money to go in and do the interventions, and actually demoralizes the local communities that are small CSOs that really want to play. So I see that there's three things we need to do. One is the consolidation and the cutting out the wastage at the top, to Simon's point of Mosul's example, but not keeping one company. It's the integrated company, the collaboration framework with the joint incentives. Then the next is the NGOs. And the third is the clusters that we need to create at the grassroots with the community so that we can balance and share the power, making sure we don't have one single individual organization in control. Thank you.
Over there.
Hi, my name is Kate Cooper. I'm a BRAC trustee. I spent most of my life in the International Development, the World Bank. The question that I have to square this circle, because I'm hearing that there's a massive opportunity, well, there are hugely valuable contributions being made at local level, which we've seen in all the countries we've worked in. And of course, there's this challenge of the large international development NGOs. What I haven't heard here is a discussion around the instruments. And I think one of our trustees, Anne May Chang, who you know well from Mercy Corps, has written an excellent book that summarizes how some of the instruments that we can use in terms of enabling organizations right at the local level to be more agile and to develop iterative approaches to local solutions. So maybe the question is, what instruments for funding collaboration or for pooling funding or for looking at alternatives that are more outcomes-based and effectiveness-oriented rather than predetermined programmatic approaches to funding is where the levers need to be pulled rather than any structure or numbers or consolidation, etc., in order to enable local organizations that are effective to grow and mature and deliver at an increasing impact.
Thank you. And Sam.
Okay. Thanks for all the panelists. My name is Sharina Tarabulsi McCarthy, and I'm an interim senior research fellow over here. I sit in HPG, the Humanitarian Policy Group. And my question to you is, I've noticed how little the political sphere, the political context has been discussed in your presentations. And I think it is like the elephant in the room when it comes to international NGOs, the practice of international NGOs versus local NGOs. And I was wondering, as we were discussing the issue of consolidation at the level of practice and thinking about efficiency, what about consolidation at the level of voice? What role do international NGOs have to play in terms of navigating that a very unwelcoming political and more often than not very charged and complex political context in a way that would protect local NGOs and give them more space to act and to meet the needs of the local communities? Because what we're witnessing right now, I mean, look at Sudan, for instance, Somalia, those are very charged political contexts, and local NGOs are more harmed. I think they're more affected by the complexity of the situation. International NGOs always have more protection. So what do you think about further consolidation at the level of voice and advocacy versus just at the level of practice?
Let me just take a couple from the online questions. I'll do another round, but I want to bring in some of the online questions. There are loads, and they're all, very good. A question from Monica Bragescu, who is the director of programs at the DEC. Having recognized that we need to free up some resources and shift power dynamics, what do each of the panelists see as their role and the added value of their own organizations in the next decade, and how are they planning to change? And a very direct one to you, Simon, from Sean Lowry at the Start Network. Excellent points from all speakers. Cheeky question for Simon. Who would Mercy Corps merge with? and a few others. We have Arjan Heenkamp, the Director of Programs at the Dutch Refugee Foundation. He has a number of questions, but one for Jonathan says, Jonathan, in my view, it is a big concern today, particularly the growing risk aversion of humanitarian organizations and donors. How would further consolidation impact on this risk aversion, do you think? And finally, several questions from Simon Maxwell, our former executive director, a decade or so ago. He says, if some NGOs, large or small, are poor quality on one or more dimensions, how do they survive? Why do they survive? Who is evaluating them? Who is funding them? And why aren't poor evaluations driving change? This sounds to me like a bad case of market failure. Who wants to start?
I'm happy to give some of those a go. Maybe combining the sort of northeast Nigeria and the BRAC one. I think context like northeast Nigeria, extraordinary levels of insecurity and risk, and I believe 2.4 million displaced people by the horrors of Boko Haram. So huge need. And by the way, I'd never say wastage in Iraq and Mosul. I would say I think there's opportunities to be more efficient. So I think there's something around the complexity of those environments, the risk, and the increasingly, and quite rightly so, onerous donor requirements on us all operating in those contexts. So the need for robust monitoring and evaluation, the need for hotlines, the need for accountability mechanisms, the increased need for anti-fraud and corruption mechanisms, etc., etc. Frankly, all of that comes with cost. And there's only a certain number of organizations, frankly, at the moment, that can kind of meet all those increasingly onerous requirements. So linking that to the sort of bit around what do you do? Well, you start with being clear on what is your role. What is the purpose of your organization? What are your skill sets? Where are your areas of expertise? And what do you have to offer? And then being really clear around that's what you can do. And then maybe there are a whole host, not maybe, in fact, there are, of course, a whole number of organizations better placed in many contexts on the ground to do the delivery of the services. And many of us kind of bigger NGOs are moving more and more to sort of systems-focused approaches, to looking more widely at opportunities to build resilience, even in those really fragile environments. And that's where you bring in the local partners, be they local NGOs or local government or private sector. So that's sort of how I would answer that. And then I'd link to the voice point, which is a really important one as well. Again, being clear around what is the role of the international NGO, what is the role of the local organization. It may well be in many contexts the local NGO or local organization is the delivery agent. And you're absolutely right. In many contexts, I lived in Ethiopia over a decade ago when the new civil society law was coming into place, really squeezing local civil society. Thank goodness it's moving in a different direction now. It's just terrific. But in those contexts, they don't have voice. So maybe the international organization and organizations together can more effectively elevate or amplify those voices in context both in country and elsewhere. Who would we merge with? You know what? We would look for an organization that's operating in a really fragile environment, because that's where we focus. That's where we think we're failing towards our targets around the SDGs, etc. That's where there's 2 billion people living in those contexts. That's the 800 million statistic, etc. And there's a few. You could put out there IRC and Mercy Corps. Two somewhat similar multi-purpose organisations. I don't know if there's IRC folks in the room or online.
David is watching. It's a bit too early for you,
but seriously, why not come together and generate all those efficiencies at a central level and around the world where we work? We're the kind of grand challenge. Some of us know IRC won the MacArthur Grand Challenge idea, but why not? Why doesn't DFID, Matthew, launch a grand challenge idea around some of this? Why don't some of those big philanthropic endeavors put money into a consolidation stream and incentivize, if not push, us as a community to walk the walk around generating more efficiencies?
Great. Let's be brief so we can take another round.
Okay. Thank you. Salma, I think you were not asking a question, so I won't comment on that. I think on the predetermined instruments, I think that's really interesting. For me, particularly, it's interesting because it suggests or it requires really listening to local communities. It's listening to local communities and accepting that they're in the driving seat of decision making. So it implies and requires a giving up of space and of power right? As well as resources. That's one thing. The second thing is that it requires a shift also in how the donors perceive what success looks like, and requirements in terms of impact, requirements in terms of monitoring and mistakes, failures, and learning. So I think my sort of simple response to that is that's the direction we need to go. It means that, you're not going there saying, I'm going to work on health and I'm going to work on education, because when you get to the community might say, actually, that's not what we want you to work on. What would like you to work on is this. And your organization needs to be flexible enough to look and say, this is what we're bringing to the community. How do we work together? But if donors are still very much asking for health indicators, education indicators in terms of implementation, then you have a bit of a discordance there that you have to sort out. But definitely something that I think is the future for international NGOs if we're going to survive and remain relevant for the changing politics in developing countries. Just quickly, on voice, I think that it's not so easy and straightforward in terms of consolidation of voice. Because if you take Christian Aid, we're a faith-based organization. And in issues of voice, let's say in South Sudan, right, sometimes we have a voice because we are faith-based organization. If we consolidated with others, we might actually lose the access to the churches and to the religious institutions that need to be at the heart and center of mediation and peace building, right? So I think that it's not as easy in terms of consolidation. However, I think we really need to think about the tactics, the diplomacy, and the different strategies at country level as well at global level. Really having discussions with whether it's CARE, whether it's PLAN, whoever it is, and saying, in this country, we are all in here together. Who has the best leverage, and how can we put those resources behind that organization to do that voice? Or how do we take a back seat and really bring up local voices? Because local agency, local movement, I mean, that is what is going to be there once we have left. So I think that there is, again, it's about the quality of collaboration. The last thing is freeing up some resources. I'm struggling with this even within our own organization, because as we look to think, how do we ring fence and ensure that the majority of the resources that we have are actually going to our local partners? Because Christian Aid works through local partners. And it is a struggle, because it means cutting jobs here. And, it's one thing to be theoretical about it, have a discussion, and everybody is in the room and saying, yes, this is the direction that we go. When it comes to implementation, it's not so easy. It's not so straightforward. Because when you talk about jobs in the UK, then it becomes a media circus, right? All sorts of things. But I think for me, my key point in this conversation is that we no longer have an option. I think it's a watershed moment. The politics of development and humanitarian intervention is changed. If we don't change, we are out of the picture. So we need really to change ourselves and adapt and become more relevant
We have to give it you, but let me bring in Nusra.
Thank
you for that, very important.
We've talked a lot about, I think, the instruments, and then obviously the voice and advocacy. I think how we use the instrument is heavily underfunded for where we sit. Lots of ideation is happening in Somalia, for a country that does pose a challenge to the sector. Lots of organizations iterating and trying to figure out what is the right level of model, cost, as well as competitive space. But I think, the learning bit is still huge. And that is a great question in terms of evaluation. How do we use our evaluation? Every program that I know, every study that we have seen, and as a consortium, we see studies almost every 2 to 3 weeks, a new study on this, a new evaluation, a new consultant. I don't know where all that data goes, but I think the instruments are there. Whether you are borrowing instruments from Google or even from from the public sector in terms of what governments use in their innovation centers. They're there. We're just not using them to have these, to sort of back up all of these claims that we are making in front of you today. I happen to think, Simon, even just to push you, if it's not IRC, why wouldn't you want to merge with one of your local partners? So I think, again, before we get to the who, it's the why. And I'm not convinced the why is so strong in terms of partnering. We have so many consortia in Somalia. Those that are technical, those that are more practical. We're going into a space where we have a very strong government. And so coordination is really, really critical. At the end of the day, though, power consolidation is also very high. And we're seeing that that grand challenge that was in front of all of us in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit, that is the change that we needed. And I'm not sure we are doing so well under implementing under that challenge. Before we move to consolidation, have we actually done well in terms of localization, participation, having more gender diversity, having more partnerships that are different from the partners that you've had in the past? One previous organization I worked with, I ended up finding that in the last 15 years, we haven't had a new partner. We have maintained the same partners for 15 years. That's not really about innovation, that's just laziness. That's no private entity, no board, no advisory steering committee would be okay with that. But there's a certain acceptance of the way that we work, and I think we have to, yes, have more grand challenges. We need to really push the envelope in terms of what's going to get us there. I'm hoping that as more and more governments come into the space, as more and more private sector comes into our space, that real competition that we've been yearning for is going to be there. And it's not going to be just competition between two NGOs. It's just going to be competition in terms of survival. And I'm hoping to believe that the best will survive. But the key questions are on instruments. Instruments are there. On evaluation, we need to, that has to be the first test. We need to share those evaluations. It is really difficult to share a document among all the 100 NGOs that we manage. And it's not necessarily because we don't have the instruments. It's something, it's more political. It's deeply, deep-seated competition that doesn't necessarily lead to growth, but actually leads to fraction, leads to cutting out of space. Last but not least, I think the evaluations coming out on localizations, I would be really interested in how those change the conversation about who we are and how we show up and what the crises of the future are going to mean for us. We need to diversify our models. It's not going to take one model to respond to the crisis of 2021 or after. It's going to be something that we haven't seen because it's just so uncertain. Last point here, for as many organizations that I work with, and I worked with many, the ones that I've seen that have been able to really truly live up to that nimble agility, diversity, culture, inclusion, have been the ones that can sort of play on two levels at once. So not looking for one model, but actually having 3, 4 to deploy. When they have fewer resources than they did the year before, they can get small quite easily. When there is that funding that comes in because of a humanitarian crisis, they can get big, but they don't have to stay big. So they're continuing to shift, and they manage change much more naturally than when they just need funding.
There was a question to you,
Risk
but we
aversion.
haven't completely addressed the question of the marker failure, why we're not, learning from evaluations and really driving a change that is building on what we have learned from those.
I think some of us are learning, actually, from evaluations and what's coming back from the field. But I do think that there are some divisions in the sector related to opinion about, actually what's best according to what position you're coming from. So I think there is quite a lot of learning, but it's just not consistent across the board. There is no coherence within the sector related to learning from lessons from the field. There was a question that came up, sorry to shift onto it, but just related to risk aversion. I'm very pleased that it came up online because that was the one I wanted to get to earlier. It will probably be no surprise to anybody in the room that for me, I look at a situation where there is already a precedent that industrial scale or big aid tends to be more risk averse. We're already there. We've seen that. And that risk aversion can be multifaceted. It can be financial, it can be related to access, it can be related to activating rapid response mechanisms quickly enough to actually get on with spending the money and getting delivery done. And as a result, what concerns me a little bit about that is that it drives a lot of organizations to make operational decisions based on two factors, which is in fact access and funding. rather than needs. And that is a major, quite bland operational point related to risk. But I would add something else to it. I think that we also have a big aid risk paradox, in fact. When I was a little boy, as I'm sure many people here, my mother always used to say to me, don't put all your eggs in one basket. I think that's a message that gets pushed through very, very heavily, and it's essentially a kind of early lesson about investment risk. I think that this big aid paradox essentially describes a situation where you've got big organizations that are very risk averse. And yet, ironically, the risk aversion to take the willingness to operate in very insecure environments where there's challenge in access, to make financial risks early on, is also perhaps the single biggest risk to the sector as a whole. Because people will look at the sector and say, well, it's not timely. It's not working in the areas where there's the most severely affected people and the most vulnerable people. And it's not dealing with the access challenges that it needs to be dealing with overall. So what is the sector doing? So the risk aversion is becoming in itself one of the very biggest risks for people to have confidence and trust that the humanitarian sector can deliver what it says it can deliver.
I have 3 minutes before I have to give the floor back to Matthew. So what I'm going to do is take 3 questions from the online audience. I think I'm really sorry, colleagues, but we are running out of time. So you can stay and talk to the speakers afterwards. But there are 3 questions that are more about the how, and I'll give you 30 seconds each, to sort of make your pitch after that. So there's a colleague from MasterCard, Louise Holden, who asks, is the drive to increase personal donations influencing smaller NGOs to increase their programs on the ground and open new offices to demonstrate where those donations are going? And so is this, designing programs actually, more of a problem, and could then, sort of have merged NGOs enabling better outcomes through digital platforms and cash delivery? Another question is from Simon Gill, from ODI, who asks, can we distinguish between the role of INGOs as wholesalers with locally based actors undertaking delivery on the ground? And then this is actually a question to you, Matthew, but maybe the panel has views on that. Again, from Ariane from the Dutch Refugee Foundation, on the merger between Save the Children and Merlin a few years ago that DFID had a role in facilitating, and looking back, whether that has created significant efficiency, effectiveness, and innovation, and whether there is anything to learn from that. So 30 seconds each. I'll start with Jonathan and we'll go in the reverse order this time. On any of the
one of the 3?
One of the 3.
I'll go with wholesalers and field level delivery. One of the things that concerns me a little bit is that there is a push of narrative, and it's quite noticeable since the Grand Bargain came out. I was with Ocha at the time that Grand Bargain was being developed, and aware of a lot of the different discussions that were happening in the development of the Grand Bargain. And I think there's a lot of narrative where people talk about working through national partners. I understand why, and that is clearly a delivery model that is very effective, and in many ways, when it's done the right way, it is certainly helping to change the power dynamics of the sector. One thing I would say, though, is there is also a concern for me that sometimes that can be done in a way that is essentially transferring risk and transferring obligation with an oversight in terms of decision-making and financial control. What I would like to see, and how we try and operate more, is instead of working through, it's working with. So to have field presence in the same locations as our partners, to be working with our partners directly, rather than having a situation where you've essentially got your staff pulled back into capital cities or into regional hubs, and then subcontracting out a lot of work. I know that's not a popular word to use, but that comes across to me very often as how that actually ends up happening. I don't think that it's a helpful way of doing things, and I think it's actually undermining a lot of the opportunity for smaller organisations, civil society organisations, national organisations, to be able to grow as they want to and as they should be given the opportunity to do.
I think, you've covered that very well on the issue of maybe it's the way organizations fundraise that may lend itself towards having smaller NGOs. No, I think that's more of just a matter of the times that we're in. Many people, young people, people that are giving charity, are looking to have more impact, are looking to make more of a personal connection with their organization or the organization that is serving their community. I think that's just more about fundraising and digital fundraising that's just becoming more and more a big stakeholder in the work that we do. I followed one amazing campaign in the US that came out about 8 or 9 years ago. I don't know if many of you have heard. Giving Tuesday sort of took respond to Cyber Monday and all the areas where it's more of the holiday commercialization of the times that we're in. So one was Cyber Monday, the other one was on Black Friday. So to contribute to sort of a better, a more giving, a more generous world, Giving Tuesday came about, and I think in about 8 years it revolutionized how nonprofits were able to access funding through online giving, through pledging from different types of communities, different givers, not necessarily major donors, but smaller, more consistent, more personal connection. And I think over 8 years it managed to put into the sector, at least in the U.S., something like $7-8 billion. That's huge. That's just a matter of where we are in the communities that we're serving and who is a philanthropist and who's a donor. That's also changing. Local actors, international actors are also beginning to tap into that. I think it's out of necessity. It's to ensure that we can access different types of funding to stay alive, to survive, and to look at what are we doing with the mission that is in front of us. I also believe, I don't have the hard data, but I also believe it's also to institutionalize a different kind of relationship with givers. They don't call their donors donors, they call them givers, and I think it sends out a different signal around how power relations happen. That when you're a giver, you're a little bit different than a donor because you're much more involved, you're much more engaged, you're seen as somebody who can really stay through the process and not necessarily just stay at a point where you are comfortable in terms of your risk sharing. So there's something about the relationship with a giver that is different than the relationship with a donor. Final thing on this is these are the kinds of things that I think is going to differentiate us in terms of whether you work in Philadelphia or Somalia. Can you financially stay alive? Can you tap into new markets? And I think the better we get at that, the more we're going to get to better, more impactful aid.
Thank you. Okay, but I've got 3 quick comments then. I think my first one is consolidation is not necessarily going to result in impactful humanitarian or development interventions on the ground. It's not necessarily going to meet the need that is there. My second point is that the diversity of civil society organizations in terms of size, in terms of nature, in terms of local, international, is really important for the health of our sector, especially at a time when there is shrinking civil society space and, we are being threatened in quite a number of countries. And then my last comment, which I want to end on the trust conversation, which we didn't get a chance to really go into. And so coming back here in the UK, in terms of, as a British charity, I would like to work for a sector or for an organization where I can connect at the very individual level with people in this country so that they feel and they know that they are giving to a cause, not just an organization, but to a cause with shared values and to a cause where they know I am actually supporting the change in lifestyles of others. So for that, I think that's where the trust needs to be. I think the trust is not about the brand. The trust is about the shared values. It's about coming to you because they can see a human face to the organization. And I think it's really important for us to land there. Thank you.
Thank you so
Right,
much.
15 seconds, yeah. So yeah, for me, the people-to-people thing, so I completely agree with that. And I think maybe in five years' time, I might look back and think some of the things I've said and others have said on the panel is a bit silly because the disruption's coming anyway. Let's be clear to the great online point about, direct giving is happening, the blockchain, the cryptocurrency stuff, a number of us are starting to pilot the ability to give directly. If we don't change, if we don't disrupt ourselves, we will be that super tanker going down. So it's happening inevitably. And just then really, really quickly on this point about the bigger organizations not in the most fragile places, Jonathan, it'd be great to have some evidence around that as well. I think the days, quite rightly, of smaller organizations being in those more fragile places and sort of, well, not quite flying under the radar, but operating with less scrutiny because they don't have the big brands. I think that's absolutely changing as well, because there's more ability to know what's going on. There's more emphasis on accountability and transparency. So I think that change is going to happen as well.
Thank you so much, everyone, for a really interesting debate. It's very clear we have to change. This is something that our humanitarian policy group at ODI has been pushing for a long time. In the report that we published just before the World Humanitarian Summit that you mentioned before was entitled "Time to Let Go," and it was really an exhortation to let go of power and control and reimagine the ways in which we work. And it's work that Christina is continuing to lead on how we have to transform the way in which we operate. So these conversations will continue to happen, and we'll try and provide more evidence. Clearly, that was an element of missing element from the debate. We need more evidence as to how we need to change. But with that, let me give the floor back to Matthew for your concluding remarks. It's been a very passionate and diverse debate. We'd be really interested in your takes.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to a fantastic set of panelists and questioners for a really vibrant debate. And I, for one, have certainly learnt a lot, and it feels like everyone has as well. So thank you. So 3 big things that I would take away. First of all, let's start with the scale externally of the need. I think that has come through very, very clearly. The numbers of people still living in extreme poverty, the projections ahead for the scale of the humanitarian challenge, all of that requires us absolutely collectively to be at the top of our game. Secondly, I'm now officially worried about the lack of collaboration in the sector. Amanda told me I should be, and what Amanda asked me to do, I do. So I'm now officially worrying about the lack of practical collaboration between NGOs operating in the same space, particularly in fragile environments. I'm sure there is more that we, DFID, as a donor, could do to incentivize that very practical collaboration before we get on to these bigger and tougher things like mergers and acquisitions and that type of consolidation. So we will go away and ensure that we're doing that. And then the third really big thing is about ensuring efficiency and effectiveness about the sector as a whole. I think that has come through loud and clear. What I personally take away is that this is much more about the international NGOs and ensuring that those are sort of properly streamlined and aligned, and making sure that in whatever we do, we allow those grassroots organizations to flourish, particularly in countries and regions where their very existence is threatened. I'm sure, again, there is more that DFID could do to help the sector adapt. I worry that if we just leave this to evolution and the market deciding, then probably it won't happen fast enough. And I think the really big threat to the sector as a whole is irrelevance. And I strongly suspect that the danger of too much change, too rapidly, is highly unlikely to come to pass. And it's more likely, if the sector is what I think it is, that there isn't enough change, that people stick with the status quo, and that people fail to get on and adapt, particularly with this dramatic technological changes ahead. So I think the hashtag #RemakeAid is absolutely right. We have got to remake aid starting here. And thank you very much to the panel for some really great suggestions on how to do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. But that's it for now. Apologies to the colleagues that wanted to come in and I couldn't bring in, but you can carry on the conversation. There is tea and coffee in the lounge, and also apologies to the very many contributions online that I could bring in. But please join me in thanking Matthew, Simon, Amanda, Nusra, and Jonathan. Great debate today. You really sparked a lot of interesting conversations. I'm sure will continue for some time to come. Thank you.